Hey, this is Eric, and today I build what might be my most controversial project to date, work with some unconventional materials, make it snow in the shop, and nearly ruin a $2,500 project for a client. Let's get right into it. Chessboards seem like a simple concept, just a couple of squares glued together and you're done, right? Yeah, but it's not quite that simple. If you were to just cut squares and glue them together, I can almost guarantee that they will get out of alignment and you will see every single gap and not have a nice continuous line all the way through the board. So following a very specific construction sequence is critical if you want it to turn out perfectly. As I'm milling the wood down, let's tackle that controversy first. On July 19th, 2021, I published a video on my channel showing how I made a chessboard for a client of mine. Simple enough, right? It was a classic chessboard made out of maple and walnut, so it had contrasting squares as chessboards do. Now, I tried to talk the client into a more modern design with some large beveled edges, but they insisted that I use the ugliest edge profile woodworking has to offer, the Roman OG bit. So instead of having a nice modern chessboard, it was plagued with an antiquated design that just looked awful in my opinion. I shared my thoughts on the design choice in the video.
Unfortunately, I'm gonna ruin this chessboard with that router bit there, so sorry.
And boy, did it upset people. I got bombarded with angry comments. People sent me email dissertations about how I was wrong, and I even had somebody drive across multiple states to meet me at an event just to tell me that the Roman OG profile is the only edge profile that should ever be used on a chessboard. I truly had no idea that people were so passionate about their chessboards. But that wasn't the biggest controversy. More on that later. What you see me doing here is milling my lumber perfectly flat. Now, I don't own a joiner, so I accomplish perfectly flat boards by gluing down the wood to a flat sheet of melamine and then running that combination through my planer. With one perfectly flat face created, I can then flip the boards over, running them back through the planer to get the other side flat as well. Is it fast? Absolutely not. But with the limited set of tools at my disposal, it gets the job done. See, you don't always need big, fancy, expensive tools, just use what you already have. And to get perfectly straight lines on the edges of the rough boards, I just use my track saw. I would buy a track saw all day before ever spending money on a joiner because it's so much more versatile. And just like that, I've got perfectly milled lumber without a joiner.
Now those walnut strips are gonna make up the dark part of the chessboard. And for the light part of the chessboard, you probably think I'm gonna use a lighter wood like maple, but I'm not. I'm actually gonna do something a little bit different, so check this out.
Whenever I build things, there's always one detail of the project that gets me excited and really motivates me to get out in the apartment garage and build. Maybe it's some type of joinery that I've never tried before, a brand new tool that opens up possibilities for me, or a technique that I want to test out. Whatever it is, I'm the kind of person that once an idea gets in my head, just ask my wife, it's infectious and it's all I'll think about and talk about for weeks until I finally get out in the shop and try it in person. This is that part of the project that really sparked that obsession for me. If you listen to my podcast, Off the Cut, that I do every week, there's a link in the description or you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts and music. You've likely heard me talk about this concept that I had for several weeks straight. First off, remember the chessboard that I built a few years back for a client? Well, they just did a complete remodel of their lake house and wanted a new chessboard to go along with the remodel. Lots of ideas were thrown around, including concrete, marble, glass, and exotic wood. The main goal was to create something completely unique that no one else has. We spitballed several ideas around, and the idea we landed on was to make a semi-opaque chessboard that would allow some light to come through. Not only would this let the sunlight shine through, but it would also really come to life if we were to set it on top of a table that had built-in colorful LED lights. Now, how am I going to make that happen? Before I get to that, what I'm doing here is cutting down a sheet of melamine into strips that is going to make a watertight mold. Melamine is basically plastic coated wood, so it's waterproof, but it's also really, really cheap to buy. To make this even more waterproof and prevent anything from sticking to it, I liberally covered the surface with just basic packing tape to create an even slicker surface for the mold. Now, while the face of the material is waterproof, the edges are not. So I'm using some of this Total Boat Thixo epoxy that, check this out, mixes itself in the tube to create a watertight seal around all of the pieces in the mold, as well as hold the pieces securely together. The Thixo epoxy makes pieces very slippery, so clamps hold everything into place while it sets up. And woodworkers love to overcomplicate and overbuild everything, so I'm also going to reinforce this by sinking in some screws into the mold to really lock things into place. But before I do that, I need to pre-drill where the screws are going to go, because the downside of using melamine, while it's cheap, is that it loves to split out, and that would ruin the watertight seal on the mold. Now, why am I so worried about this mold being waterproof, and how am I going to make a semi-opaque chessboard? I'm going to be using epoxy. This is deep pour epoxy, which takes a lot longer to cure, but it also means more time for bubbles to escape and not get trapped underneath the surface. This stuff does get expensive, so if you want to make a project, I've got a coupon code for you down in the description below for all Total Boat products, as well as a few other brands too.
I didn't think this one through. I'm gonna need a lot bigger bucket. All right, hopefully this bucket works, and let's get back to it.
Somehow I always underestimate how big of mixing bucket I need whenever I use epoxy. But the good thing about it being a deep pour product and taking longer to cure is that I'm not rushed for time before this all hardens and sets up. I do have a pro tip for you when using epoxy though. Put some kind of object like that paddle mixer through the handle to let all the epoxy drip out. Not only does it save you money because you get all the epoxy out of the bins, but also gives you those oddly satisfying drips. It's a win-win. Now, the hardener part of the epoxy mix is water thin, so make sure you don't splash it all over the place. I don't want the epoxy to be crystal clear, and since the client mentioned the initial idea of marble in the board, I'm going to throw some of this white pearlescent pigment in. It's just super fine powder that will dye the epoxy, but also has small metallic flakes that will give it a sort of marbling effect. One of the biggest reasons people fail when using epoxy in their projects is simple: lack of mixing. It seems ridiculous to mix this stuff for several full minutes, but you truly need to do it. And to make that whole task easier and less tedious, pick up one of these paddle mixers for your drill so you can just stand there and relax. Now I can pour the epoxy into that watertight mold and give everything a swirl to reveal that sweet marbling effect. One of the major downsides to using deep pour epoxy is that I had to let this sit for an entire week to fully cure and harden. If I tried to work on it too soon, it would still be soft and gummy, which would make it next to impossible to cut and work with. So when it comes to epoxy, when in doubt, always give your epoxy a longer time to cure. Since I lined the mold with that packing tape, you can see how easily the epoxy breaks free from the mold. No need to use that expensive Tyvek or tuck tape that people use. Cheap packing tape is all you need. Now we've got ourselves a solid marbled epoxy block that I can treat just like wood. First is milling the block down just like I did with the walnut before. You will notice that working with epoxy gets very messy very quickly. Those tiny shavings of plastic statically cling to everything, and be careful because the edges of this block are razor sharp. You can see as I run it through the planer to flatten it out that it literally looks like it's snowing inside my dust collection tube. But it gets even worse when you try cutting it on the table saw. Tiny shards of epoxy are being thrown at my face, which is why I put on a face shield. It does not feel good when those little guys hit you. Remember how I mentioned earlier that making a chessboard requires very specific steps to ensure the board looks flawless? Rather than cutting individual blocks, I like to use a different process. I'm at the point where I can cut down my first strips of material and then glue them back together. This whole process of making wood and epoxy chessboards is uncharted territory for me. While I didn't film it, I tested several options and processes behind the scenes to make sure this would actually work before diving into a full-scale project. I'm actually working on another huge project at the moment. My Patreon supporters who get access to tons of behind-the-scenes videos know about that new project, but I am not quite ready to share that yet with all of you. But outside of that huge project I'm working on, there is another uncharted territory for me, and that's lawn care. But I can relax because I'm using RX soil this year. Fall is an ideal time to test your soil. It allows you to address garden and lawn soil issues before the dormant winter period. Whether it's correcting your soil pH in the off-season or doing your first check for heavy metals in the garden, fall results give ample time to fix problems before the spring growing season. RX Soil makes sending your soil to a lab easy and convenient, providing you with fast testing and easy-to-read reports and a friendly lawn team to help you understand what it all means for your garden and home. All of your sampling supplies arrive at your door. Just dig down 2 to 6 inches in the area you want to test, scoop up the soil into the provided testing bags, seal the bags, toss them back in the box that has prepaid mailing labels, ship them out, and you're done. The awesome thing is that it doesn't take forever either. There is a turnaround time of 2 business days at the lab, and all package prices include 2-way shipping costs, sampling materials, lab fees, reports, and email and phone support. Head to rxsoil.com or check the link in the description and use promo code SDC for 10% off your soil testing at checkout to get your soil tested and prepare your lawn for the dormant season to fix problems before the spring growing season. I let the epoxy cure for a few days, and now I can mill those glued up strips down perfectly flat again. You will notice that I tinted the Thixo epoxy black during that glue up. During the testing phase, I sent several samples to the client, and they actually preferred the look of the black epoxy kind of bleeding through the white marble epoxy. Now, it wouldn't be my first choice, but hey, I'm not the one paying for the chessboard. And payment, that's another big area of controversy my previous chessboard sparked, but more on that later. By far, the most important step of making a chessboard is right here. Do not mess this step up. I need to cut those strips again at a perfect 90-degree angle. Now, I truly hate this red track square, but I let a friend borrow the blue TSO one that I love, and it's a fraction of the price. But it allows me to trim off the excess from the board before bringing it back over to my table saw to cut more strips down. If you're someone who is interested in all the exact dimensions of every single cut, I've created a step-by-step PDF plan that guides you through every step of the build over on my website, and they're linked down in the description below. Pro tip here. Make sure you take these cuts nice and slow and utilize a high tooth count blade during this process. That will ensure that you don't get any tear out on these cuts, which will show up on the final chessboard. We want this thing to look absolutely flawless. Now for the last 2 strips, I widened my fence to make slightly larger pieces that give me more margin for error on the next glue up. Again, all the dimensions you need are in the plans, imperial and metric, and it makes this super easy for you to build yourself. Alright, here's the fun part. All it takes is flip-flopping these pieces and see how that chessboard comes alive. Let's mix up some more of that black Thixo epoxy, making sure all the squares line up, let it sit for a few more days, and then come back to mill everything flat once again. Why do I reflatten the board every time? That's easy. I am far from perfect, so when I glue up strips, one of them is going to be just slightly higher or lower than the next. You will absolutely feel that with a chess piece, so I want to bring the board back to flat after each glue up. It's the small details that make a huge difference when building chessboards like this. You will also notice how much thinner the board is now compared to when I first started. Yes, there will be a decent amount of waste with a project like this, but building it this way is significantly less stressful. With the board perfectly flat again, I now have to trim it to its final size. Again, a step that demands a lot of accuracy. So I'm using some setup blocks to mark exactly where I need to trim off the excess from the board. This gives me a visual indicator where I need to place the edge of my track saw to get a perfect cut. And when making critical cuts, always make sure to throw some clamps on the track to keep it from moving. Back over the table saw, I will take multiple cuts, slowly sneaking up on the final size until I absolutely nail it. Now, is this amount of finesse and stress overkill? Probably, but attention to details like this is what allows me to charge a premium for this board. Remember how I alluded to that huge point of controversy in my last chessboard video? By far the thing that upset people the most was what I charged. I charged $2,000 for that chessboard. People were absolutely floored that somebody would pay that or that I would charge that amount for a chessboard. But here's the reality. This chessboard is something that is completely unique that you can't just go buy in a store. Clients reach out to makers like myself to bring their unique idea to life because they can't find what they want anywhere else. Now, could you buy a $75 chessboard made out of wood online? Absolutely you could. But the person buying that board doesn't understand or doesn't care about all the extra details that go into a truly custom chessboard. Conservatively speaking, labor alone on this board was well over 25 hours, plus a few $100s of epoxy, wood, materials for the mold, overhead, and other expenses bring the total price of this chessboard to $2,500. If you're interested in an exact breakdown of how I price all my work, I will leave a link to a video where I share my exact process and even include a spreadsheet that does all of the math for you. That's linked down in the description below. Is $2,500 too expensive? Too cheap? Just the right price? Let me know down in the comments what you think. The next step for this board is to create the border. I went back and forth with the client about what to do here, but we landed on continuing that marbled white epoxy look on the outside as well. If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you know that I've tried doing something like this in the past with disastrous results, where I ruined a client's $5,000 table.
So that $5,000 check that they wrote me a couple weeks ago and I had cashed, I now had to write them a $5,000 check.
All because I forgot to clamp down the wood before pouring the epoxy. I'm actually working on a redemption effort for that table, but that's a video for another day. To prevent the board from floating, I clamped it down to the mold before flooding it with another gallon of the marbled epoxy. After several more days of cure time, no leaks happened, so I was in the home stretch to get this board wrapped up. I just need to get the board out of the form, and I can knock out a few final steps. But that wasn't as easy as I had thought.
Should have used some mold release, but I think I have an idea.
I was in such a rush that I forgot to lay down that clear packaging tape to act as mold release for the epoxy. When the two parts of epoxy are mixed together, they heat up and cure through a chemical reaction that causes the curing or hardening process to start. Without a mold release like packaging tape, that heat can cause the melamine to fuse to the epoxy, which is why you see all those wood fibers from the melamine sticking to the side. For a second, I truly thought that I'd ruined the board after all this hard work, but I can salvage this thing with a little brute force. First up, I can grind off everything protruding on one side of the board with my sander to give me an at least moderately flat surface to then run my track saw on top of to trim the edges off the board. I have to do this step first because the board is too wide to run through my planer at this point. But once it is down to a size that is capable of running through my planer, I can slowly work my way through all the melamine that was fused onto the surface. Yet again, another reason why when you're building chessboards, start way thicker than you want and bring it down to its final size towards the end. After the melamine was removed, I can flip the board over to remove all the excess epoxy on the opposite side. The board is just about done here, but you will notice that there is still some extra material on the edges. I grabbed a 1/2 inch setup block, aligned it with the outside of the squares, and used a knife to mark exactly where I want to trim the board with my track saw. I truly think track saws are an indispensable tool for woodworkers. Just align that plastic cut edge to your knife mark, and you know the saw will follow it perfectly. And of course, with critical cuts like this, make sure to clamp things down too. With one cut established, I can head back to the table saw to bring the board to its final shape. This taking a million cuts isn't just for the camera. I truly do this all the time in working on critical cuts because it gives me more margin for error to make sure things are absolutely perfect. Does it require more time? Of course it does. But I'm much more confident when I go to make the final cut by just taking my time, taking it easy. At this point, the board is to its final shape, but we aren't done quite yet. This workbench I've built a few videos back has been so helpful. With all these dog holes, I can just toss in these soft silicone pads in the holes and hold the chessboard perfectly still during the sanding process. I will leave a link to these and all the other tools I'm using today in the description below, as well as exclusive coupon codes for tons of brands to help you save some of your hard-earned money on your next project. The nice thing is that I don't need to sand to a super high grit, just enough to remove the marks on the wood. I've got a trick to finish the rest of the board that will give an insanely durable finish that is also incredibly smooth and glossy. I built this melamine tray to keep things clean when I work with epoxy projects and to add an insurance policy against spills, something I definitely would recommend building. To finish the board, I'm going to flood the surface with this self-leveling tabletop epoxy. The awesome thing about finishing it with epoxy is it will fill all of the scratch marks on the epoxy layer below and give a crystal clear look. Although it is self-leveling, I find it works best to work and spread the epoxy around to even it out as much as possible. And although it looks like a mess, I am intentionally having it pour over all of the edges. But when you pour it on, it's very cloudy and foggy. But that's because there are bubbles trapped in the epoxy from all of the stirring and mixing. But check out this trick. Grab a heat gun, and you can pop all the bubbles, leaving you with crystal clear surface, and after a few days of curing, this chessboard is, well, it's not done. I need to attach some clear rubber feet to the bottom to keep it stuck to the table and also give it a nice soft sound when it's set down. All right, now it's done. This epoxy and wood chessboard idea was something that I truly wasn't sure I could pull off, but now that I have another project challenge I want to try, but that's for the next video. See ya.